Welcome, everyone. This is the last event this academic year for the Citron Center, and it's certainly a highlight, and really happy to see all of you here. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor John McWhorter, whose writing I have long admired. And before I say a little more detailed introduction, to just tell you how it's going to work. I'm going to introduce him. He's going to take over. He's going to speak for as long as he wants, and then he's going to take questions, and we'll end a little bit before 5:30, and there'll be a nice reception outdoors, okay? So, John McWhorter is a professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University after having an earlier teaching stint right here at Berkeley. He earned his BA from Rutgers, his MA from New York University, and his Ph.D. in linguistics from Stanford. Professor McWhorter teaches the study of American linguistics. He's a scholar of American linguistic history, and his scholarship encompasses consideration of Native American languages, immigrant languages, Creole languages, American Sign Language, Black English, and other speech varieties. He also teaches linguistics and music humanities for Columbia's core curriculum program. He's not just a distinguished scholar, as we know, but also a leading public intellectual. He's the author of more than 20 books, including The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language, Losing the Race, Self-Sabotage in Black America, and Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English. In 2016, he published Words on the Move, Why English Won't and Can't Sit Still, parentheses, like, comma, literally, paren. And in 2021, he published both Nine Nasty Words and the widely read Woke Racism. He writes a weekly column on language and race for the New York Times, which many of us read every week, and hosts the language podcast Lexicon Valley. And so the audience here today, John, testifies to the widespread interest in your thinking and writing. Welcome.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for your patience in how long it's taken for us to actually do this. And what I want to talk about, not for too long, is the issue of language policing and where the impulse comes from, and why I think that we have fallen into engaging in too much of it these days. And it's a difficult issue because the idea that we're supposed to pay very special attention to what words and phrases we use in describing the world around us comes from what begins as a very constructive and reasonable impulse. And so, for example, to say chairperson rather than chairman or chairwoman, or to try to always say actor instead of talking as if there's some separate class of actresses or heroines as opposed to heroes, I think most people would agree that our tendency to police, so to speak, that aspect of things is a good thing. The idea that there are different essences of being male and female within the same capacity and that we should use different words, that was something that deserved to be battled against. It was something I was exposed to myself in the early 90s, and I don't remember feeling any kind of resistance. Language does have to change. But the problem is that reasonable missions have a way of creeping. What begins as concrete often ends up becoming abstract. And I think that's what we've seen a lot of, especially over the past few years. It's not that all of this starts in 1991 or even 1971, but I think that especially in light of the events of 2020, other than the pandemic, we have seen a new impulse to portray it as a kind of enlightenment to feel uncomfortable about saying just about every 10th thing we might want to say. The idea is that there's supposed to be a revolution in how we express ourselves that perhaps no human beings in the 300,000 year history of our species have ever imagined forcing themselves to undergo. And the question is whether it's reasonable. And by reasonable, what I really mean is useful. Does it help anyone? Is there a purpose for it other than ones that are perhaps more about the self than the society. And what I mean is extensions of the idea that we use language in non-sexist ways into something different, which is an impulse to see slurs in as many ways of expression as we can. So it's one thing if a woman doesn't want to be referred to as an actress as opposed to an actor. I think a critical mass of thinking people will agree that society does advance, if slowly, and that this is a reasonable change in language. But what we're being asked to do is something different. And so I'm just going to take one of many examples. If it was just one example, it wouldn't be worth talking about. But there is a general tendency these days. We see lists. It tends to come from well-intentioned progressive institutions, but we see these lists. And so, for example, at Brandeis, the Prevention Advocacy Resource Center, a little while ago, proposed a list of terms that we shouldn't use. And so now we're supposed to go beyond chairperson and actor and hero and Ms. and other things like this that I don't think occasion controversy, and I would hope wouldn't. It's got to be more than that. And so, for example, this Brandeis list suggested that it is against the imperatives of social justice to use a term such as walk-in. You shouldn't talk about walk-in service because a person who unfortunately is not able to walk for one reason or another might feel offended or singled out by the use of that word. You should not use the word survivor if someone has had something bad happen to them. You don't want to use the word survivor because that implies that whatever this person experienced is now over when there still may be repercussions that they're feeling. So you don't call someone a survivor, you say that someone has experienced something. Someone is not a survivor of cancer, they've experienced something. Someone is not the survivor of an earthquake, they are the experiencer of an earthquake. I'm not picking the more colorful ones. I'm actually picking rather randomly from the list, and all of this was meant quite seriously. These are words that you're not supposed to say. The list suggested that we reconsider saying African American. And the reason is because if you call someone African American, you're implying that they're hyphenated and therefore othering them. So the term African American is to be suspect. As you can imagine, this list was quite copious. And it's not just Brandeis. There are many lists like this. And the people who are proposing these lists are proposing them with the best of intentions. But the question is, where does this sort of thing actually take us? Is it worth it? Does it actually conform to what linguistic science says about how people speak and how people process language? And then more to the point, does it help anyone? And these are questions that have to be asked. And the point is not just to laugh at people making lists, but to examine whether these good faith efforts are worth, I hate to say it, but paying attention to. And so, for example, one thing that a lot of these lists that urge us to revise our terminology tend to neglect is what Steven Pinker, the psychologist at Harvard, has called the euphemism treadmill. The euphemism treadmill refers to the fact that if there is a term that has attracted negative associations, if there's a term that now is used more as a slur or in dismissal than as something neutral, then one might think that the solution is to change people's perspective on whatever that thing or group of people is by using a different word. But the problem is that in about a generation, whatever the associations were with that original term end up settling upon the new term anyway. Now, that is not fun. It's unfortunate, but it's true. It's really hard when something is unpleasant, but it's also true. And you can see this again and again and again. And so you could see crippled on buildings not too terribly long ago. That's unthinkable to us now. Crippled was changed to handicapped because of unpleasant, unfortunately, associations with people who were handicapped, except I'm dating myself and saying handicapped now because the term after this, when that term wore out, was disabled. Disabled is now wearing out, and there are other ways that we refer to the same kinds of people. It will go on and on and on. That's the way language works in a society. Another example, one that we might not think about as consciously. When I was young, which is now no longer the case, but when I was young, I had a mother, as most people do, and I think it would surprise many people to know that my mother was a social worker, hard left social worker who did not like white people very much, frankly. That was my mother. And that person, even that person in the 70s and into the 80s, if we ran into someone on the street who was asking for money, that person was called a bum. That's what my mother called that person. All of her peers called that person a bum. We would never call that person a bum now. We call that a homeless person. However, to take you back, homeless is on that Brandeis list. Homeless is now a word that we're being told we should revise, not only by Brandeis. The idea is that we might say a person who lacks housing or the like. Now, it's one thing to live in our own time and to think, okay, we need to revise that one term. But the broader picture is that there were tramps, then there were bums, then there were homeless people, and now we're going to have a new term, which, if we use a little imagination, go forward about 25 years, if we start saying person without housing, that we're going to start saying very quickly, oh, without housing person, and that's going to take on the same associations, and then we're going to have to change it again. That's how these things work. The euphemism treadmill is just there. And so it's one thing, we all live within the present, but it's one thing to say we're going to change the term in order to encourage a new kind of thought. But in many cases like this, the negative associations are going to settle down upon the new term. Now, that's not the case in something like saying chairperson instead of chairwoman. Whatever the negative associations were with chairwoman are not going to settle onto chairperson. Chairperson is a true, clean, neutral term. But when it comes to these one-to-one replacements, there's always the fact that the gnats that settled on the first term are just going to follow to the next one. And so whenever you hear these impulses to change terminology in this way, that's something that must be kept in mind, that things aren't always going to be the way they are now. And the sad truth is that constructively, one might be more interested in trying to change thought rather than changing words. There's a certain relationship. However, it is small, it's thin, it's slippery, and it's temporary. In terms of changing how people perceive, one must argue, one must learn rhetoric, one must get out there. Changing the names of things in comparison is not only trivial, but it almost never really serves any purpose. That's one thing. Another problem with this idea that we must look for things that might offend people is that a lot of the offense is predicated upon a sense of language that neglects something very basic about how we use this big collection of words in our heads. Linguists call it polysemy. That's Polysemy, polysemy. That's many meanings. It is not just unusual, it's not just a one-off, but it is the norm that a word that we use doesn't only have that number one definition that we have it in the dictionary. And so, for example, back. If I say, what's back? The first thing you think of is the body part, okay? But if I give something back to you, it has nothing to do with your back, if you think about it, and you probably use that back more often than talking about your own back or anyone else's. You're going to give it back. Let's go back. Now you can see with go back, if you put it in between the body part and giving it back, that back has come to have something to do with returning things. And so there's this gradual process where the original word, which refers to that part in back of you, is abstractified into meaning a whole bunch of different things. Okay, that's how words work. But that means that imagine someone saying, I don't wish to be reminded of my back for some reason. And so don't talk about giving a present back or going back to the 7-Eleven. that wouldn't quite work because we think back is many things. Another example is the head. We all know what the head is. This is my head. Now, here's something that we probably say more than we say when we're talking about the head. We headed up the coast. That's something people say a lot in this state, for example. We headed up the coast. What does that have to do with your head? Nothing really. It's a different word. It did come from head. If you say you're going to head out from a party, it's not your head. When we say head, even if we have a vague sense of there being a core meaning, we mean a great many things. That's just the way language is. We make the most of a little. And so that brings us to, for example, at the University of Southern California. A lot happens at that school, I'm noticing. A lot of the stories come from USC. University of Southern California in the School of Social Work. There has been a suggestion that social workers don't talk about the field. You don't go out into the field. You don't do field work. I had a mother. She was a social worker. I grew up listening to that Black woman talking about field work all the time. If anything, it was a rather warm word. It had to do with her professionalism. It had to do with her thinking that being out in the field was doing well in the world. At USC, the idea is that the word field shouldn't be used in that way. And by extension, in general, with areas of study, that it's not a good idea because some Black people might be reminded of plantation fields. That's the rationale. Now, if that were the case, then we would be talking about something that makes civic and civil sense, just like not saying actress or heroine. But the question is that true? When somebody uses the word field to refer to social work and being out in the field, does that really mean the same thing as a field with poppies in it? Or a field where people were forced to work without wages in a tragedy that happened in what is blissfully the past? Is that what anybody's thinking? Well, no, or at least it hasn't been proven, and I doubt if anybody would feel that it would be useful to do an experiment to see if it was. There's too much polysemy. A field can be many things. Field is used in physics to mean something quite different. The idea that a word only means one thing is based on a rather hasty conception of how we handle our words, and the energy devoted to looking for a source of offense like that, thinking that it's maybe considerate not to use that word, might be better spent doing the sorts of things that one does out in the field to try to make the world a better place. Polysemy is important, and a lot of our language policing tends to ignore it. Any linguist thinks of it. Whenever one of these prescriptions comes down, what we often murmur among one another is, but what about the polysemy? Well, what about it? So that is a major issue here. Another thing is that, frankly, a lot of the prescriptions are not especially logical. And so, for example, slave. The new idea, I think it's enforced actually by the New York Times. It is, yeah, is that you don't say slave, you should say enslaved person. Now, I completely understand the impulse there. Slave. A person might suppose that slaves were inherently slaves, that it was inherent to their condition. Many people would mention that thinkers such as Aristotle very casually thought that. Aristotle was a while ago, but still, it's something that one might consider. So instead you say enslaved person, because that makes it clearer that the slavery was something imposed upon that person rather than an inherent quality of theirs. Okay, now pull the camera out. Bum, okay, that won't do. Homeless person, because that implies that the condition is something imposed upon them. It comes from the outside. It's not that they are a bum, it's that they are a person who is burdened with the condition of homelessness. So I'm not doing a PowerPoint because I think that gets overdone these days, but if I had one, I would give you one slide. So bum, homeless person, slave, enslaved person. Why is this wrong and this is okay? So enslaved person is now considered the height of progressive wisdom when you're correcting somebody. But homeless person has to go because it's kind of a slur. The larger lesson is that if homeless person got old that quickly, what's going to happen to enslaved person? In 20 years, enslaved person is going to have the same associations. And so maybe the more important job is teaching that slavery was imposed upon people. And let's face it, that's not the hardest lesson to teach. It's rather obvious. And to the extent that there are people who are going to miss it, we could explain it. Instead, having this business of telling people that they have committed some sort of linguistic felony to say slave, especially around young people, just doesn't serve any purpose, because enslaved person isn't going to last. And by that, I don't mean that I don't think it's going to last. I know it won't. In a generation, enslaved person will be just the same thing that happened to homeless person during my lifetime. These things need to be thought about. There's an illogic to a lot of the sorts of things that we're being told we're supposed to do. There's more. I'm reading a book. I read them. And it's about political science. And the reason I'm pausing here is because I'm trying to get the title. And I don't ever say And the title is the author is Timothy Schenck, The Realigners. It's this wonderful book. It's about how people create coalitions and change history gradually. So what do you do to actually create change? There are people who hate each other and have completely incommensurate aims. But if you're going to win elections and get bills passed and get things done, then you have to be a realigner. And there have been various people in our history who have been this kind of realigner, bringing people together and doing the hard work. Believe it or not, one of those people was Martin Van Buren. You know, this non-entity of a president. Actually, he was more interesting than I thought. And part of it is that he drew together the slavocracy of the South with a certain kind of flinty northern, what was at the time called a Republican, a Democrat Republican. Now it will be the Democrats, that party genealogy. And he brought them together and won about 1.5 elections, the idea being to create an America better than the presumably monarchical Federalist division. He brought people together. There are various people who have done it or tried. Barack Obama was trying to do that. But politics is hard. Creating change is difficult. It's work. We read about the work. We read about how hard civil rights workers worked. It's one thing to watch Martin Luther King give a stirring speech. That was 1/100th of what that man did. He worked. He was out on the ground. He was talking to recalcitrant legislators. He was out working. And I don't mean being in jail and getting physically hurt. That's horrible. But even if that doesn't happen, creating change, civil rights, progressivism, fighting for the poor, it's work. And it's easier to believe that change never happens than to allow that it happens slowly. It's slow. It's not fun. You know what's fun? Making lists of words and jumping on people for using them. It's a little easy. It's easy partly because of our technology. We have social media. If you made a list 30 years ago, you would hang it on a door and, you know, there you go. Maybe it would get published in a newspaper letter column or something like that. Now you can put it right out there. And so it ends up being, frankly, a kind of politics that is suspiciously easy to do. Real change involves getting out on the ground and engaging in grassroots activism and making a case and knowing that everything isn't going to happen instantly. That's what our forebears knew. And we're beginning to lose that. And talk about pulling the camera back. This is crucial. Pull the camera back and go back in time. It's always a useful exercise. And you have to remember, it's one of the hardest things about going back in time, as if I have, is that the pictures of these people are in black and white. And so it looks like they aren't real. So make it in color. Go back and you're at a party with Martin Luther King and Lorraine Hansberry and Bayard Rustin and Roy Wilkins. You're at a party with all those people and they're not in black and white pictures and they're moving. You can smell the room. These are real people. Imagine telling them, you know, you all are doing important stuff, but you would be doing better if you also policed language more. You should be more concerned with what things are called. You should be more concerned with phraseologies, and you should be reading the Riot Act to people who use the wrong word. All of you would be better off if you did that. Imagine saying that to A. Philip Randolph. Imagine having a conversation like that with Pauli Murray. Imagine talking to W.E.B. Du Bois, and you're at dinner with him. You're at Chez Panisse with him, and he's in color, and he's moving. And you say, well, Dr. Du Bois, have you thought about policing terminology because you would be doing a better job? Notice how absurd that is? What would they have gained from what is now becoming so popular and seen as some form of social justice? Because make no mistake, the people who are doing this are not ridiculous. I'm not saying that they're ridiculous. They think that they're doing a kind of good. They think that this is part of social justice, to forge different ways of thinking through teaching people not to say things. You can get where they're coming from, but the question is, does it work? Is it plausible? And one way of examining that question is, should people have been doing it in the past? And to the extent that you can imagine, Lorraine Hansberry, she was a person of words. She was very concerned with forging change, even forging change in the abstract way of writing plays and writing articles as opposed to marching in the street, although she did that too. Imagine her, not in black and white, but in color, smoking her cigarette. And you say, Lorraine, okay, yeah, congratulations on Raisin in the Sun. I want to bring something up with you. You can imagine the look on her face. If you've seen more than a few photos of her, you can imagine what she would say. She was right. What we're doing now is an unfortunate detour from what creating real change is. And we need to think about it. It's like in Alice in Wonderland, the Cheshire Cat. The Cheshire Cat fades and just leaves the smile. The Cheshire Cat is activism. The idea that you tell people not to say walk-in or homeless person, and that's social justice, that's just leaving the smile, including that it feels suspiciously good to police language for something that's actually supposed to be hard work. Hard work almost never feels that good. So that's another problem with this whole way of looking at things. And I'm going to go somewhere because I think it's partly my responsibility. Yes, the N-word. We've got a problem with that. And so, for example, we're being told in many quarters, and if this room is those quarters to any extent, I'm sorry about the word that I'm about to say. It's not that word, it's Negro. We're being told that the word Negro is a slur. Teachers all over the country are being read the Riot Act, hauled up before judicial boards for using the word Negro. Now, of course, almost never is anybody calling someone Negro. It's an antique term at this point. I don't know if it's an insult. I know an older Black gentleman who always calls me Negro, and he means it affectionately, but we won't go there. That's subtle. Negro is an ancient term, and okay, now African-American is the term of art. Great. But if somebody is reading from something that, say, Martin Luther King wrote, and he used the word Negro all the time, is that teacher really supposed to euphemize the word Negro because it's a slur? Who said? What this is this idea that it is social justice to seek something being classified as a slur. And the question is, where does that get us? What is the purpose of it having been decided about 7 years ago by certain people under 30, frankly, that Negro is a slur? What's the point? Who does it feed? What housing does it build on what side of the city? What's the point? There's an idleness about it. And I'm not going to say the word, but that other word. This new idea that to refer to the N-word is the same thing as using it is absurd. It is utterly absurd. And the reason that I'm putting it that way is because I'm old enough now to remember when, within reason, you could use the N-word because everybody knew that you weren't actually using it. You were referring to it. And, uncannily, I remember that being the case in what was probably this room when this floor was laid out differently at a conference in what would have been the spring of 1996. It was an African American Studies conference. It was a conference that was kicking off the first year that African American Studies was a graduate program. And I have a vivid memory of that word being used, and not in a jolly way, not in a colorful way. It wasn't being read from Zora Neale Hurston. It wasn't only Black people. It wasn't Black men calling each other buddy. People needed to use the word. Many of them were white, and within reason, you could. I frankly think it's ridiculous that I can't say it here. But I live in, 2023, and so I, as a Black man, cannot say it. Okay, I have bigger fish to fry. But that was not the case in 1996. In this city, downtown, somewhere on Shattuck, I remember doing one of my first radio interviews where somebody asked the new young linguist what the history of that word was. I've still got it on cassette. It's one of my early interviews. And no, I don't sit around listening to it. But I remember very well that I and the white host and the other person who was on the show, who was also white, probably said the word about 7 times, and nobody batted an eye because we weren't using it. We were referring to it. Now we don't do that. And frankly, I don't think it makes any sense. I don't think it serves any purpose. And the reason I say that so arrogantly is because life wasn't that different in 1996. Everybody understood the difference. There was the occasional person who would push it too far, and they would be ostracized. They would be condemned, sure. But that kind of person was very rare. Evil is very rare. And yet we have a situation now where we're encouraged to treat that word as if it were a magic word. The idea is that you can't utter it at all. It's as if we're a very different and frankly less reflective culture, where now we can't read Huckleberry Finn. I don't know how many times people have asked me, what do I do about this book? How do I read it to my child? A white person asks. And I can guarantee you that Black parents are just reading the book. But if you're not Black, then you have to have Jim saying slave, which is not what he's saying, or you don't read the book at all. And so Huck Finn becomes contraband. The problem with this is this. Already, the illiberalism that we're seeing from both sides, there is the right-wing book banning and an aspect of the right wing that is basically saying, don't stir all of that stuff up and don't teach it to kids. Then on the left, you have the prosecutorial wing of the woke, who are basically throwing people out of windows for being offensive. All of that is primitive. All of it sounds either medieval, or it sounds like yellow journalism in, say, 1895. It sounds like people in Congress beating each other up. It's primitive. And notice, I'm saying this is from both sides. We're regressing. It's also regressive for us to create a magic word in a way that a smart 9-year-old can't even understand. And we've only created this over the past 20 or 30 years. And to what end? To what purpose? No one was offended in 1995 when somebody referred to the word, but now we pretend to be. We're pretending. We're taught to pretend. And my we here is mostly Black, but I think it also extends to fellow travelers. It's fake. It's a pretense, and we all know it. It's primitive. And some things are just going to stay the way they are. But that policing of language is another example of something that doesn't make any sense, doesn't serve any purpose. And frankly, it builds no lower middle class or upper working class housing in previously suburban zone districts. It creates nothing like social justice. It's just posturing. That's what language policing can lead to. So what I'm referring to overall is the simple fact that pursuing social justice is very important. It ought to be a central focus of anyone who is a concerned citizen. All these things are extremely important. But there's a mission creep where we call ourselves forging social justice, where what we're really doing is something that's focused on making ourselves look good to other people. It's like showing faith within a religious body. And there is such a slip between the intention, i.e. social justice, and the actual result that I really do think that we have a problem. Activism is going out and actively doing something. Our new tacit idea is this. Activism is finding ways of being offended, either for yourself or on behalf of other people. Activism is finding ways of being offended. I think many people would say that that is activism, but the question is, who does it help? Interesting historical parallel, depending on what you call history. About 15 years ago, a book got around. It was called Stuff White People Like. It was hilarious. And it skewered, I hate to say it, but I remember at the time thinking it's a lot of people in Berkeley. It's a lot of people in New York and places like Park Slope and the Upper West Side. It's white people who I know. And it's me to an extent. And it satirized, the tastes in food, the TV shows, what you like to wear. There were about 100 things. And one of the things that it nailed right on the head, I think the book was 04 or 05, was being offended. That this white person likes to be offended. And that was right on, because that person did wear T-shirts, espousing certain causes. And there was a certain theatrical quality to the being offended, but it was better than nothing. It was a harmless little jibe. What's interesting is that today, that joke wouldn't land, because the very same people are so committed to being offended that they would find it insulting to have it mocked in that way. It's not funny anymore. And I actually read an interview with the guy who wrote it, and he said, that's that. The book is obsolete based on that. That's a big social change. And frankly, what was the joke then is kind of a joke now. Being offended as sport. The reason that it's wrong is not only because it's fake. Fake is wrong, but it's not a moral tort, but because it doesn't really help anybody. Being offended alone is not activism. Activism is getting out there and doing hard, slow, boring work. The language policing culture that we're dealing with now is a symptom of our having moved away from that. And what worries me about it is not just that it doesn't look good and it doesn't taste good, but that I feel that a whole generation of people are losing a sense of what it is to go out into the world and try to change it, and are missing that going out into the world and trying to change it is not going to be about warmth. It's not going to be about group fellowship. You're not going to feel like a happy warrior. It's not going to be fun. It's not that kind of thing. I worry that we're going to lose that at a time when we're losing so much else. And so our language policing culture at this time worries me. And I would have to say, it's not really about me being a linguist. I think that, whatever the worth is of anything that I've said, anybody who's halfway awake could see things in the exact same way. This isn't me being linguist. This is me being moonlighting, cultural commentator, editorialist. But I really do worry that action has become empty gesture, and that there's a whole cadre of people who feel and are being taught by people who ought to know better that they're on the side of the angels and creating something called social justice, when frankly, they're not. I'm going to stop here. Thank you. So this is the part where I answer some questions. And so if anybody has any, please raise your hand, and then I'm going to go like that. Sure.
Thanks for comments. Just a couple of questions. So one is I'm curious why you think you can't say the word that can't be spoken. Because it was my understanding that there are a group of people of which you're a part that are able to use and say that word.
With other Black men, if I'm
Yes.
buddy. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So that's one thing. So it's a little more complicated. It's a little more complicated than just a taboo.
Yeah.
Against anybody using it.
But if I said it here, the world would keep spinning. I've done it, but it just makes people so uncomfortable that I figure I'll make them uncomfortable in other ways. So.
And the second thing is, you started off by saying the move from actress to actor is not a problem, even though the inequalities that those words express still exist. So I'm wondering, what is your principle? So that's okay, but other things you say are not okay, like disabled to, I don't know, differentially abled.
Mhm.
So do you have a principle for distinguishing between changes that are that we should all applaud and sort of take to distinguish those from things that we should try to resist?
Sure. Yeah, there are things that, first of all of society agrees are important issues. Now, there's a where do you draw the line issue, but there is in everything. But with walk-in, how many people who are hindered from walking are offended by that particular term? Would we expect that they would be, given the nature of polysemy? That's different from the idea that 50% of humanity is of equal quality and equal capability to the other 50%. That has been something denied for most of human history. We're in a society where that kind of thought was changing anyway in the early 70s. And one can imagine that if you don't say heroine, if you don't say actress, new generations will be less encouraged to think of there being these differences anyway, which are fading. Obviously, sexism persists. Obviously, the inequalities persist. But there, we're talking about a very elementary distinction, and the substitute is not something that can wind up being processed the same way. So it's one thing to say, don't say actress, call everybody an actor. Actor is not going to start being seen the way actress will be. Don't say homeless person, say person deprived of housing. That's different because the gnats are going to come over here. That's because you're dealing with a one-on-one substitution. Now, gray zones, master. So I get that you might not want to call the person who heads the dormitory a master. That's what happened at Yale. That might feel a little odd. On the other hand, me not being able to call where I sleep a master bedroom when nobody was thinking about that master at all, that's one where reasonable people might differ. So there are cases like that. But with sexism, I think that it's a slam dunk, whereas with things like don't say survivor, less of one. Mhm.
Yeah, my question is this new, and why is it new now?
What is
Like
this?
the idea of policing language, why weren't people up in arms and printing lists at universities of words you can't say in the 40s?
Well, everything changed in about May of 2020. So this happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning that came afterward. And a lot of social justice ideologies had the floor at that time, and this language policing exploded then. And so George Floyd, that was a horrible thing. But one of the weirdest times, I'm obsessed now with 2 years. One is 1966, because I think the whole country turned upside down that year. It's not just me, it did. And then 2020, because there's just this cocktail of what happened to George Floyd, the pandemic, and realizing that spring that we were never going to go outside again. It was spring, and that made that especially hard. And there were these things called Zoom and Slack that became universal. All of that together meant that extremist ideologies could spread even faster than Twitter had them doing before. And so that is when, it was that summer that these language policing initiatives started getting around. Or to be more responsible about it, it was the winter after that when they started popping up here and there. And it was the idea being there's going to be a reckoning in not only how we process race, but how we process people in general. And all of this is well-intentioned, but it crept into unnecessary places. That's why now, I think. Omar.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the talk. I want to push you though on the timeline, right? So, I mean, all of culture is boundary drawing, right? So in some ways, all of language is policing. The French are policing language. And so we do have examples from the civil rights era of like capitalizing Negro, right? Or is somebody that do they get a Mr. or Mrs. in their name in the newspaper, right? Like those are part of the movement. And so there is that kind of language activism happening in that era. And so I think, I wonder how we might think about the longer timeline and what then is special about this category than not. So that's one thing. And then just as a related provocation, I think the analogy on enslaved person is car crash, not homeless person. And the activism there is to say, when we have car accident, it sort of takes away an agent, right? There's like the car accident doesn't just happen, somebody's driving, right? And so with enslaved person, what we're trying to do is like remind ourselves that there's like this is not just something that happens, but is an active process, right? And so I'll stop there. But so there's a longer history to the language policing than maybe we're acknowledging. And in some of these cases, there's a different kind of intervention. It's not the treadmill, but rather let's think about agents and not make something passive.
Mm-hmm. No, those are important points, and I'm gonna go somewhere. On capitalizing Negro, on Mr. and Mrs. To an extent, those are the sorts of things where obvious kinds of disrespect had been entrenched. And it was pretty easy to make a case that this needs to stop in the same way as there needed to be a Ms. as opposed to a Mrs. And so there, I don't see that as unnecessary. I'm sure you and I would agree that back then there was still much, much less of this sort of thing. So of course, language has to change. But here's the place I'm going to go. Negro. All of a sudden in 1966, it has to be Black. That's all I've ever known. I'm comfortable with Black. But in the grand scheme of things, what did it do? Where would you or I not be if we were still being called Negroes? And more to the point, and because Omar, you and I were both at Stanford at the time when it became African American overnight. So what's happened since then? Apparently now Brandeis thinks that we shouldn't say it. Really? I think we'd be fine if we were still being called colored and Negro. There was a certain idleness, and I think it's partly because Stokely Carmichael was the beginning of an awful lot of this kind of theater. I don't walk around not liking the term Black because I've only ever known it, but Negro would have been fine. And then in terms of enslaved person, et cetera, I take your point about there's an agency aspect to it, whereas homeless is somewhat different. But my only question is, to what end? Who are we helping? What would you say? Like car accident, car crash, who does it feed?
Well, I mean, a classic headline in a newspaper is car hits 5 kids. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's like, car didn't hit 5 kids. A driver hit 5 kids.
Yeah.
And that there's a kind of absolution that's happening in the language, and that we actually want to be more precise about, no, there's somebody doing something, and that we don't want language that actually is absolving a particular agent of their action. Right. So
I get it.
Yeah.
Now is where I have to be the linguist. The reason that that I can't see that as important, and I'm not dismissing what you're saying, but is because languages differ in terms of how they convey agency, and an awful lot is context. If car hits 5 kids, nobody's thinking that it was this self-driven car. Like you imagine some drunken idiot behind the wheel. The other day, and I'm not trying to imply that my Spanish is that good, but some people were cleaning my house. They don't really speak English, and I left my keys. So I went back in and I said, "The keys forgot to me." Like there's this weird expression. No, I forgot the keys, but the way Spanish does it is that it forgot on me, the keys. That's just the way you put it in Spanish. I don't think that in English, I feel more responsible for forgetting the keys than the women did. That kind of thing. So I take your point, but I think context is more powerful than we often suppose. Jack.
Okay.
I have to call on Jack.
2 things. One is, I agree with you that things have been ratcheted up. But of course, in universities, speech codes began in the 80s, and then they were taken to court and they were ruled unconstitutional, but the beat has certainly gone on in different ways.
Yes.
But I want to ask you about particular words that we hear and you at Columbia hear every single day, which are diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And so speaking about the treadmill, I wonder if you think that equality has moved to equity as part of the treadmill,
Mm-hmm.
and what's going to follow equity? What comes next?
That's interesting, Jack. Equity hasn't replaced equality because of the treadmill. Equity is a fig leaf term for saying we're going to make it all come out even through forcing the matter rather than through traditional means. We're going to make everybody equal by transforming standards. And if you think that what I really mean is lowering standards, you are correct. The jig, never know whether it was gig or jig, the jig is up on that. That's beginning to be clear. And I wouldn't be surprised if equity in a generation is replaced with some other artful, probably Latinate term that means the same thing, probably. Diversity is fascinating. Now my 11-year-old is getting that diversity doesn't mean what it means. Words change, words meanings change, and that's been an interesting narrowing, and it was almost inevitable that it was going to happen. These things happen. In New York, did I just write this? I want to make sure. No, it's not from that. Okay. New fact. In New York, back in the day, there would be truant officers running around the city trying to get kids to go to school. And so they were from the truancy office. Those people started being called the truancy. The truancy is going to come get you. As if like truancy is supposed to be the state of not going to school, but it was watch out for the truancy, hide around the corner. That happens. And so diversity has happened in that way. Inclusion, I first heard the term used that way on this campus when Prop 209 happened, and people started talking about the value of people feeling included in a community. I don't see that term is going to change, but that use of inclusion, I've often found it very sneaky because once again, what it tends to mean is I will only feel included if you don't evaluate me according to the standards that you evaluate other people. And I don't like it. I wish that people would be straighter about it and say, why is it that you feel that the standards should be changed? What is the reason? I remember, there's so much I'm remembering just being in what used to be called Barrows Hall. In this building, I remember, this is a nasty little story, but it's been so long that it's tellable without me being nasty. I was in a meeting in the wake of the eclipse of 209 when many faculty were hoping that something could be done about it. I was very concerned about all this and very naive about the political aspects of these things. I was just this linguist. I was doing a lot of theater, and people were so upset about the ban. And I listened to the conversation, and I know that now people were using the magic words and there were certain assumptions. And I just said, I imagine myself talking in a high voice, although I had the same voice then, but I was this child. I said, don't we want to make it clear to everybody why standards need to be changed? Why people need to be included under new conditions? Because if we're not going to say why, then we haven't made a case. And the room just sat there. Nobody was looking daggers. Nobody could imagine that especially a Black professor would say that. And no one answered. And then they just kept talking about their stuff. That wasn't right. But I didn't know what the terms actually meant at the time. Here we are. Ma'am.
Hi, I'm Pia Deshpande. I had a question related to, I think, something really interesting you're picking up on regarding the fact that it's easier to police language than do kind of the hard, often boring, often difficult work. Yeah, of enacting social change. And in my mind, that I'm imagining a model where we have this amount of capital we can spend on action, and you can use it policing language, you can use it to march, you can use it to protest, and maybe something you're tracing is that people are now using more of that capital on language policing than they are on more productive versions of social change. I think an assumption that I want to question there is whether more people now are involved in the project of social change than they were in the past, in part because it might be easier to assuage your own guilt, to assuage whatever you're interested in, or to produce real social change by beginning at the policing of language and then perhaps becoming more involved in those spaces and doing the actual difficult work. Because I think if that assumption doesn't hold, this limited constant version of social capital, then maybe there are actually good externalities to this language policing that we're seeing today. So, yeah.
That is really important. And it's a little early for me to say this, but where are the people who are going to step two? So there's all of this terminology. A lot of it is part of what's called doing the work. It's been a while. Are we seeing a critical mass of those people saying, okay, and now that maybe we've taught people better ways to think, now I'm going to go out and knock on some doors. Okay, now I'm going to go lobby. You know, I'm going to do some real work that involves contacting. We're all going to contact 150 people, and we're going to try to get them on that. I'm not seeing more of that. What I'm seeing is people thinking I'm doing the work by sitting around feeling offended at something someone said to me or that someone said about others. And that's what worries me. But let's say that all of this really ratcheted up in 2020. This is early 2023. Maybe it's a little early to say that nothing else happened, but I'm worried that it isn't. So I can go halfway with you on that. Wow. The gentleman with glasses and mustache. Yes.
You refer to activism, and then you talk about doing the work. And my sense is that there's an awful lot of so-called activism that's not doing the work. It's just getting out and making a racket and annoying people and getting in the way of things. And instead of trying to sit down and figure out how to get something done, isn't there a danger of the word activism being used a little loosely?
So activism means just that you go out of doors and raise your voice. Yes, there's a problem there. However, I think that there are people who are protesting in big masses, and that at least at first can be a useful statement and show that there's a massive sentiment. If you stop there, then you're just having fun because you're hanging out with people and it's a nice day. But that is a nice way to begin. The person who lays down in front of a bus because he doesn't like the Vietnam War, that was taking that sort of thing too far, because what did that do to really help the situation? But activism can itself be done idly as well. And in the Black community, it's known beyond a certain point, getting out and doing another march is not creating change. Yes, I'm not aware of that being something that threatens to take over what activism is among people who are engaging in it. It's just we don't hear much about the people engaging in activism because it's not dramatic and it's not about not saying the right words. But I take your point. Activism can become theatrical in an idle sense too. One worries about that. Sir.
I'd like to make a comment based on your framework to a comment you made that caused a little nervous laughter in the room. Here at the University of California, we cannot say Kroeber, LeConte, or Barrows anymore, but our distinguished faculty don't mind being called Berkeley, as if Bishop Berkeley was any better than Professors Kroeber, Professor LeConte, and President Barrows. What do you think of that?
I am ignorant about Bishop Berkeley. What is the issue there? I just want to know what the issue
He was a slave owner.
Okay.
He viewed native people as savages.
Yeah.
He actually willed to Yale University his slaves, and the university is now paying reparations in response to that. And yet here we have a commission that's looking to understand what to call the University of California, which we are, and whether it should be Berkeley or Cal.
You can't say Kroeber?
You can say it.
But he's not on the building. Okay. Yeah, I heard about that today. Right. Yeah. I don't get it. Yes, I do get it. Part of social justice under this idea of being offended is that you prove that you're a good person by sticking your middle finger up at very dead people in order to show that you disagree with their views. but it's willful simplisticness, really. Everybody essentially in the past was a bigot. That they couldn't help it. It's all they knew. And so the question is whether their entire lives were devoted to bigotry. So a statue of Robert E. Lee, I would say, yank that down, sure. But if we're talking about that almost anybody can be proven to have written or said something that we would think of as rather repulsive, I would dare anybody today to get through dinner with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a naked classist. That's just the way people were, and it didn't matter what color you were. It's gesture over activism. I don't get it. I mean, it's interesting. I like all movies, but that includes old ones, right back to the silence. I'm obsessive. I like them. Whenever I see a movie, especially in the 30s, when you can hear people talking, etc., I think every single person in this would not have wanted me to marry their daughter. Yeah, every single person. And boy, do I like those movies because they are very dead. And the thing is, everybody felt that way, and I'm enjoying like the 99.9% else in it. I don't like that. I don't like the idea that anybody would want to rename Berkeley because of that man's actions, unless that's basically all he did. I don't know anything about this Berkeley person, but if that was the main thrust of his life, I get Woodrow Wilson's name being pulled off of Princeton buildings. He was racist even for a Southerner at the time. I get that. But this business of Kroeber, I mean, that's getting into my stuff because that's Native American language, etc. He wasn't an evil person. He was just somebody who lived 400 years ago. That's more years ago. I don't get it. And as you can see, that makes me almost emotionally upset. It's willful simplisticness. Miss in the back.
So you mentioned lists, and I want to know like nowadays, there's like a long list on social media about AAVE like words, and I just want to know like your thoughts about it because I know you mentioned lists and how you think some of them are just like unnecessary. I don't know what you think about that.
What is the list of Black English words?
It just
It's gonna
like
make me angry again.
no, it's not.
Okay.
It's just like the words of like ain't, like you can't use ain't because it's African American vernacular, and I just want to like I just want to like, and they're mostly made by white people too. So I just want to know like what you think about that.
That's the cultural appropriation argument. So the idea is, and it's not that anybody thinks that there shouldn't be spaghetti in the United States. Cultures, of course, are going to blend. But the idea is that you're not supposed to borrow from a culture that's subordinated. Now, originally, the idea was you're not supposed to take something from the subordinated culture and make more money off of it than they did. So that's the Elvis argument. That makes sense. But the idea that white people can't say ain't, I mean, not even getting into that white people have always said ain't, but let's say it's an actual only Black English word. White people can't have it is once again recreational offense. And so why is it that white people can't have it? And some people would say, well, you're stealing from us. But are we less ourselves because a white person is using the word? No, we're our same selves. And if it means that there's a little bit less of a difference between Black and white, I thought that was what we were looking for. Now, it seems that the cultural appropriation argument constitutes a tacit idea that when it comes to the very particular situation of the descendants of African slaves in the United States in the early 21st century, that there is not supposed to be any kind of cultural coming together, that white people are and non-Black people are supposed to walk by with a certain respect. Latinos are allowed to visit, but that there'll be good feelings, but there's not supposed to be this appropriation. And the problem is, one, what does the appropriation hurt? And no one. And two, how realistic is it that Black English is not going to permeate modern American English when rap music is America's favorite music, and we now have 2 generations of non-Black kids who have grown up thinking of it as just music? It's just not going to happen. So it's I don't know which list you're referring to, but I'm sure somebody put it together who felt very good about it, and then they went beep and they put it out, and there's still Black people who need help, and I don't think any of them care if somebody says ratchet or booty or whatever it is. Doesn't matter to them. It's also a rather educated notion. So, sir, I'm sorry I keep I'm trying, yeah.
It's an exercise program, I guess. Yeah. Just wanted to mention a linguistic mechanism. If you drove for a day's drive due north from Columbia, you find this in issues like actor and actress, the exact opposite mechanism being used, where now to emphasize the fact that we want to be inclusive of both genders, there is a repetitive word. So instead of saying Canadians, you would say the Canadien, the Canadienne. And you listen to the discussions, everything has the duplicative aspect in it. Exactly the opposite of what you were talking about for actor and actress.
Yeah. And those are harder because it takes more energy. It makes a sentence longer. I don't imagine that those are going to catch on as easily as when you're dealing with a single word or a single ending. Latine is probably not going to expand beyond a certain rather elite set. But that sort of thing is one thing where you have one ending, Latine or Latinx. But no, those doubles are tough. It's why he, she has never truly caught on. You needed to go to one thing. Usually it's more likely to catch on then. At least linguistic history over the past 60 or 70 years suggests that. You. Sorry.
Oh,
Are you?
which one?
You won. You.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I mean, this brings so what's happened to sort of Latinx is kind of interesting because we've seen that. I mean, there's research that shows now that people who are actual Latinx, they don't like it. They don't agree with it. And so I do sometimes think that it's not so much that people are being offended. It's almost like they're being offended on other people's behalf. And there's almost like this condescension there where they're trying to say that, oh, you're too stupid to even know what to be offended about. So we will be offended on your behalf. And I wonder if you agree, and if yes, like, where does that come from, do you think?
I agree. And what's going on is that a lot of this professional offense taking is concentrated among people who are highly educated. It's not, frankly, normal thought. It's rarefied thought. And that's something to think about. There's nothing wrong with people in that sector having a jargon all to themselves. But if the idea is that you are trying to make a better world for Latine people by using these words, then I would say that, yeah, there is a certain arrogance about it. So for example, the neighborhood that I live in Queens, I'll bet every 2 out of 3 people speak Spanish. I've lived there for 7 years. They are working class and lower middle class people. I have never once heard Latinx from any of their mouths. I only hear that when I go to Columbia. And there's all evidence that that's the way it's going to stay. And yeah, there is a certain sense that we're educated. We know better than you what you should be offended about. It's an aspect of being cosmopolitan. No one says it, but it's there. And I often think to myself, for example, with social work and field, how many social workers, Black social workers, are actually thinking about that, as opposed to a very few who are sitting on certain committees. So yeah, it's unfortunate. Sir.
I want to defend Martin Van Buren, the wizard. No, that's not it. I teach history, so it's just in high school. And so I've seen what you've talked about with Huck Finn got pulled out of our English department a couple of years ago. And I was blindsided by it because they didn't tell me about it. And I said, how many people have read Huck Finn when I'm teaching about the antebellum? And they said, oh, no, we don't read it. I was like, what?
That
It would have been
really
nice if I'd been told.
Doesn't work, no.
And
There's no real movie to watch. Yeah.
And it wouldn't do what I wanted to do anyways. The question I wanted to ask for you, though, is you really look at 2020 as being something different. Would you see the way American culture tried to tamp down on leftist rhetoric and politics in the 50s and trying to get rid of communists, the Red Scare? Wouldn't you see it as somewhat similar? Whereas in the 50s, we were more conservative culturally, politically, and in media than we are today, where more liberal perspectives have control of those places. Isn't it somewhat similar? It's just very puritanical.
Very, very similar. The obsession with quote unquote commies, which really elevated in the 50s, but had really started after the Palmer raids. You can read the same sort of sense of people being more concerned with their own goodliness than anything actually going on. The same loss of charity and tolerance of other people, a sense of obsession, a sense of people who are afraid to go against the new orthodoxy. This is a human tendency that can come from many places. I recommend, by the way, and the reason you get me thinking is because the book I read before this Realigners book is the new biography of J. Edgar Hoover. And it's called G-Man, and it's by Beverly Gage, and it's 700 pages long, and it is so good that I spent 4 weeks rushing home because I wanted to get in my chair and read about J. Edgar Hoover. And what a wicked man he was because of this sort of thing. So yeah, it's the same thing. These are human impulses. There's nothing extraordinary going on. It's just where those impulses are being channeled at this point. McCarthyite, that's what a lot of this feels like. Sir.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that you're saying policing language is not always necessarily bad, but it is bad insofar as it distracts and takes resources away from the real work. And I would agree with that. And I also think there's so much that needs to be done that we should devote our resources to. I'm just wondering if you do see a role for language or linguistics that can contribute to social justice, beyond just policing. Is there something else that we can do with language that can really help in a real way?
In other words, do I agree with George Lakoff, the linguist here, where, you say membership dues instead of taxes? And I would have to say no, not just because I want to go up against George, but because all of that ignores the euphemism treadmill. And so I was braced by work of George's, like, Don't Think of an Elephant, et cetera, about 20 years ago. And the Democrats took him up, the idea being that if we change language, we can create change. But after a while, I started to realize all of those snazzy terms, and he was very clever with it, wouldn't have worked because people who didn't like the taxes or the this or the that were not going to like them more because you changed the name. And I have never talked to my former colleague George about that. I'm sure he has an intelligent answer. Maybe there's something I missed, but no, I don't think it's about language. I think it's about going out and doing. Of course, speaking suasionally, sure, but not jiggering with terminology. The way people think is the way people think. And if you're going to change it, you have to make an argument, not change a word. I know what you mean. Yeah. Jack, I can do one more and then my legs. So, I love Q&A. Sir. Well, all right, sir, and then the woman in the back. Yeah.
Oh, just a quick question. Do you have advice about how we could talk to our students about not being offended? How to be more resilient and so on? Because I get I try not to offend my students. It's not my intention.
Sure.
But people are offended, and I'm wondering how I could help them be more resilient.
Give me an example of the offense that you've run up against.
Well, I teach in the law school, so I teach things like self-defense.
Then I don't need it. If you teach in the law, I know just what you mean. Okay. To be honest, an argument that I use a lot in situations like that is, where are you going with this in terms of a vision of changing society? What offends you? Why were you offended? Often I say, you wasn't offended by this 15 years ago. What's different now? And the main thing, and I'm sure you know this, is that when you confront someone like that, even in a civil way, they're not going to allow that you change their mind while you're sitting there. You're just going to get the same resistance. But you can look in people's eyes. There's something that happens in people's pupils or something where you can see that you did get through. They're not going to admit it to you, but I consider myself to have done a job to just present them with other ways of looking at these things. That can be really hard in a law school atmosphere these days, I know. But you plant a seed and then people go off and kind of lick the wound. That's how arguments, in my experience, are usually won. Takes time. Ma'am?
Sorry, I don't want to end this on a hot button issue, but it's the one language change over the last couple of years that just really makes me grind my teeth, and that's pregnant people. What the hell? I mean, I get that it's supposed to be inclusive of trans men and non-binary, who still have their female body parts and they can get pregnant, but it feels like it diminishes women. I mean, what are the linguistics on that?
It's not the linguistics, it's the common sense. I think so many enlightened, well-intentioned, hip women are offended by that I think society is going to make a case against it, and therefore something that's extremely biologically counterintuitive already is not going to catch on beyond a certain world where people say Latinx. I mean, there is definitely emerging a kind of high academic college town jargon. But the question is that going to be what the Washington Post writes? Is that going to be what people are saying drinking their Chardonnay in a yard party? No, that one pushes it too far, luckily. So, thank you very much, folks.
Well, thank you so much, John. And before we move on to the reception, I would like to take a minute here to thank the people who do the real work of making these events happen and who have been really central to the success of any program we have. And so those are Eva Cito, who's the Associate Director of Social Science Matrix, where we sit now, Serena Groen, who's the Administrative Director of the Poli-Sci Department, which is our institutional home, and her assistants, Stacy Owens and Christine Nera, and also our two great undergraduate assistants, Gracio Lee, who's been here with the mic, and Ishan. And last but not least, I want to thank Professor Gabriel Lenz, who's sitting there, who's been for the last 5 years the chair of the Faculty Executive Committee of this center since its inception. And so, Gabe, thank you so much for all you've done too. Now, food and wine.